Welcome to the lecture on selections from John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism. I'm Andrew Chapman, and in this lecture we'll be looking at Mill's normative ethical theory that bases the ethical status of actions on the consequences of those actions in terms of the pleasure or pain brought about by those actions. We'll look at the particulars of the theory, as well as why the theory seems so plausible. But then we'll also look at a number of problems that most philosophers have taken to be fatal for the theory of utilitarianism. Says Mill, "The creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. Pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends, and all desirable things, which are as numerous in the utilitarian as in any other scheme, are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves or as means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain." Notice here what Mill is saying to you. There are only two things that matter for morality: pleasure and pain. Mill calls them happiness, but then notes right away that he's talking about a very specific picture of what happiness is. Happiness is pleasure. Unhappiness, pain. John Stuart Mill was a 19th century British empiricist philosopher and political theorist. He's been called the greatest English-speaking philosopher of the 19th century. His empiricism is very important for understanding his overall philosophical views. Empiricism is the philosophical view that justification comes from the senses and from nowhere else. Since Mill thinks that justification comes from the senses and from nowhere else, it's unsurprising that he thinks that pleasure, a sensation, is the thing that's good, and pain, another sensation, is the thing that's bad. Mill lived from 1806 to 1873, so most of the 19th century, and he can rightly be called the father of contemporary political liberalism. John Locke is the father of liberalism at all, really created and developed the doctrine of liberalism. Mill, however, developed it in its modern sense and gave it to us in the sense that it is celebrated in the contemporary Western world. Since we're talking about ethics in this lecture, it'll be important to remind ourselves what ethics is. Ethics, or morality, and I'll use these two terms interchangeably, is the study of the right and the wrong, the good and the bad, the better and the worse, the virtuous and the vicious, the fair and the unfair, the just and the unjust, from the perspective of the best overall reasons. Thus, the evidence employed by ethicists is reason and argumentation. Ethics is an investigative discipline that's concerned with what is true in its particular domain. Now, just as, for example, biologists are concerned with determining what's true about particular cell functions, ethicists are concerned with determining what's true about the right and the wrong, the good and the bad, the better and the worse, etc. And just as biologists are not concerned with what anyone's mere opinion or set of beliefs are concerning particular cell functions, ethicists are not concerned with anyone's mere opinion or set of beliefs concerning what's right and wrong, good and bad, better and worse. Perhaps anthropologists, sociologists, historians, psychologists are interested in what people believe and why they believe it across time in different cultures, etc. Ethicists are not concerned with this. They're trying to figure out the truth, just as biologists are trying to figure out the truth. Mill's theory is a normative ethical theory, so it'll be important to understand what normative ethics is. Normative ethics is the subdiscipline within philosophical ethics that studies how particular things get the ethical or moral properties that they have. That is, what grounds ethics. Normative ethics isn't primarily concerned with which particular people, states of affairs, or actions have which particular ethical properties, but instead with an overall explanation of ethics. So, for example, people might debate whether meat eating is morally permissible or not. However, the normative ethicist isn't concerned with particular issues like meat eating. The normative ethicist is trying to give an overall theory of what might make things right or wrong, good or bad, permissible, impermissible. So conclusions from the normative ethicist might be applied to particular issues, but the normative ethicist herself isn't concerned primarily with those particular issues. The goal of normative ethics is to provide a coherent theory of all and only the basic ethically relevant facts, the necessary and sufficient conditions for something's having an ethical property, such that if you find something that meets the necessary and sufficient conditions for having some ethical property, it does have that property, and nothing that has that property does not meet those conditions. There have been three approaches to normative ethics throughout the history of normative ethics. These three different traditions, three different ways of addressing normative ethics, are three different ways of asking central ethical questions. Each of these approaches takes a different thing or object to be the main unit of moral evaluation. One way that normative ethical questions have been asked is by focusing on the person, the actor, the thing performing actions. By focusing on the person, we would ask which sorts of people or character traits are the better ones and which are the worse ones. This is the tradition that's associated with Aristotle and those influenced by Aristotle. A second way of approaching normative ethics is to focus on states of affairs. If we focus on states of affairs, the question we'll ask is, which sorts of states of affairs in the world are the better ones and which are the worse ones? This is the tradition, the approach that's been associated with the philosophy of John Stuart Mill and those influenced by him, and this is the tradition, the approach that we'll be looking at today. And finally, a third way of approaching normative ethical questions is to look at the action first. If we look at the action first, what we'll be asking is which sorts of actions are the better ones and which are the worse ones. This is the approach that's been associated with the tradition of Immanuel Kant and those that are influenced by Kant. Now you can see that each one of these approaches is asking questions about the nature of ethics, about what grounds ethical properties. The approaches just come at these questions from different directions, and therefore we get different theories because these approaches come at these same questions from different directions. So now let's turn to Mill. Mill, who says, begin ethics by looking at states of affairs. According to Mill, the primary unit of moral evaluation is the state of affairs. A state of affairs is a technical term that just means a way that things are. When evaluating a state of affairs, we need to know which components of the state of affairs are morally relevant ones. If this sounds a little bit technical or a little bit confusing, just look around your room right now and note the objects that are there and the relations that they stand in to each other. This is a state of affairs going on in your room right now. It's just a way that things are. Now, Mill says that some states of affairs can be morally better than other states of affairs, and we'll want to know what it is about certain states of affairs that makes them morally better than other states of affairs. According to Mill, Ethics should primarily be concerned with the sorts of states of affairs that we should bring about, and only secondarily concerned, if at all, with the sorts of people that we should be, or the sorts of actions that we should perform. Now, it's important to notice that caring about states of affairs is different from caring about a person's moral character or caring about a person's intentions for actions. For Mill, it's not about individual actors or characters, but about the entire world that the individual actor is embedded in. Mill's theory is a version of the normative philosophical theory known as consequentialism. Consequentialism is the normative ethical theory that holds that the sole determinant of the moral status of an action is the actual consequences of that action. The consequences of an action are the differential states of affairs that are brought about by that action. So, for example, the consequences of some action, A, are the way the world is after A is performed. Consequentialism is entirely unconcerned with the person performing the action, the intentions of the person performing the action, the expectations of the person performing the action, and the type of action being performed. All that consequentialism cares about is what happens after the action is performed. What are the consequences of the action? So look at the way that the world is after the action is performed, and that's all that matters for determining the moral status of the action. It's very important to note that consequentialism is not claiming that consequences are morally relevant. It's saying that the only thing that's morally relevant is consequences, and that all of the consequences are morally relevant. Mill's theory is not just a version of consequentialism, but also a version of utilitarianism. You note that this is the name of his famous ethical work, Utilitarianism, and this is the name of his theory. Utilitarianism is a particular type of consequentialism that holds that the only consequences that matter morally are those in terms of pleasure and pain for all things that can experience pleasure and pain. So as we noted, consequentialism says that consequences are the only things that matter, but we need to figure out which sorts of consequences are the ones that are important. According to utilitarianism, which is a version of consequentialism, the consequences that matter are those in terms of pleasure and pain, and the sorts of things that matter are anything that can feel pleasure or pain. Good consequences, according to Mill, are those that raise the net pleasure and or lower the net pain for all things that can experience pleasure and pain. Bad consequences are those that lower net pleasure and or raise net pain for all things that can experience pleasure and pain. So you need to look at all of the consequences for all of the things that can experience pleasure and pain in terms of pleasure and pain, and see what the consequences of some particular action are for all of those things. Now, of course, since you, the performer of the action, are a thing that can experience pleasure and pain, your pleasure and pain are morally relevant. Utilitarianism is not saying just sacrifice yourself. However, all pleasures and all pains of the same type are morally equal. No thing's pleasure or pain is more important than any others. So your pain is just as important as my pain. My pleasure is just as important as your pleasure. You can notice that there's a sort of fundamental egalitarianism in utilitarianism. Note that for utilitarianism, utility and utilitarian have technical meanings and don't just mean useful. There's a popular term, utility or utilitarian, that means use or usefulness. That's not what these terms mean for utilitarianism. So where did this theory of utilitarianism come from? Well, let's look at a very brief history. Jeremy Bentham, alive from 1748 to 1832, is the father of utilitarianism. Bentham's utilitarianism was somewhat different from Mill's, but it was still a version of consequentialism in terms of pleasure and pain, and that's all that utilitarianism is. James Mill, alive from 1773 to 1836, was John Stuart Mill's father. He was good friends with Bentham, and young John Stuart Mill was greatly influenced by his father's relationship with Bentham. Bentham would come over to the house, talk about utilitarianism, and young John Stuart Mill would hear about utilitarianism from Bentham, this towering figure in British philosophy, and would see his father, a man that he respected and feared, talk to Bentham and understand and respect Bentham's position. So this gives us some understanding of why Mill himself took up the banner of utilitarianism in his professional philosophical career. Central to understanding how utilitarianism works is understanding what's known as the utilitarian calculus. Calculus here doesn't mean the specific form of mathematics that calculates particular changes with respect to other things. Calculus here just means a calculation. The utilitarian calculus is the name for the cost-benefit analysis that allows us to determine which actions are morally better and which actions are morally worse from the perspective of utility. And recall that utility here is a technical term meaning the net increase in pleasure and/or net decrease in pain. Disutility is the opposite of utility, the net decrease in pleasure and/or the net increase in pain. Mill thinks that an increase in pleasure and a decrease in pain are the same sort of thing, utility. And an increase in pain and a decrease in pleasure are the same sort of thing, disutility. So if you're given two potential actions, call them action A and action B, to determine which of the two is morally better, look at the consequences of A and look at the consequences of B in terms of the utility and disutility brought about by A and by B. Whichever of the two, A or B, produces more utility and/or less disutility is the morally better of the two actions. So think about a very simple cost-benefit analysis that you might run if you're doing an economic survey of something. You've got two different options. There are known good things and known bad things. The bad things subtract from your benefit, so they're your cost. The good things add to your benefit or subtract from your cost. And you just add things together. You sum. Take the net good and the net bad, add them together. Take the for each of the actions and then compare them with each other. Once you've compared them with each other, you can see which one's better by which one results in a higher sum. What matters for morality, according to utilitarianism, is the actual consequences of actions, and not the expected consequences or the intended consequences. Remember that utilitarianism, as a form of consequentialism, motivates itself by looking at consequences. So the consequences are the things that matter here. If somebody says, well, I expected particular consequences to come about, but other consequences came about, doesn't matter. What was expected isn't important. What was intended isn't important. What's important is the actual consequences that come about from a particular action. You've probably noticed that there's an essentially comparative nature to utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a comparative moral theory. This is one of the unique things about utilitarianism. What this means is that utilitarianism can tell you, given two or more potential actions, the moral ranking of those actions. Utilitarianism compares actions with each other and then shows you how their moral status compares. However, Given just one potential action, utilitarianism can't say whether that action is good or bad, right or wrong, whether the consequences of that action are good consequences or bad consequences. You always need at least two things for utilitarianism to give you any moral result at all. So this is important. If somebody tells you that they've got one moral action and the consequences of performing the action are such and such, you can't tell, no matter what the balance of pleasure to pain is, whether that action is good or bad. You need to compare it to some other action. So, for example, if I tell you that eating a slice of pizza will cause me great pleasure and that it'll only produce minimal pain, maybe, for example, in the animals whose products went into making the pizza, you can't yet tell me whether eating the slice of pizza is a good thing to do or not. You need to compare it with some other potential action. Maybe, for example, not eating the slice of pizza. So if I say, should I eat this pizza, you have no idea. If I say, should I eat this pizza rather than not eat this pizza, now we can get to work. And again, the fact that an action produces a lot of utility is not on its own any indication of moral status. And similarly, the fact that an action produces a lot of disutility is not on its own any indication of moral status. One of the main improvements or changes that Mill made to Bentham's utilitarianism was to add in the concept of higher and lower pleasures and pains. He did this because an early and prominent criticism of Bentham's version of utilitarianism was that Bentham's version was a doctrine fit for swine. The reason for this criticism is that, remember, a pig's pleasure and a human's pleasure are morally equivalent things. Thus, why shouldn't a human just commit herself to doing swinish things? Whatever a pig likes to do, why wouldn't a human just do that as well if pig pleasures and human pleasures are morally equivalent with one another? Mill's proposed solution to this problem is to divide pleasures and pains into what he calls higher ones and lower ones. According to Mill, the higher pleasures and pains are the ones that are produced by intellectual and aesthetic faculties, while the lower pleasures and pains are the ones produced by bodily faculties. So, for example, going to the symphony, enjoying the symphony on an intellectual or aesthetic level, that's a higher pleasure. Just eating a whole bunch of junk food and enjoying the junk food on a merely bodily level, that's a lower pleasure. Having one of your dreams crushed, that's a higher pain, an intellectual pain. Having your foot crushed, that's a lower pain, a merely bodily pain. Now, what's the relation between higher and lower pleasures and pains? Any amount of a higher pleasure is better than the same amount of a lower pleasure, and any amount of a higher pain is worse than the same amount of a lower pain. So you can think of higher things as multipliers of the goodness and badness of lower things. Says Mill, it's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it's because they know only their own side of the question. So we've seen the basic mechanics of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a simple and very plausible theory. Here are a few reasons why utilitarianism is so plausible. Well, why do we act at all? Why do we care about things at all? Why do we make plans and have relationships at all? A plausible answer to this is that we do all of these things to have an effect on the world, however large or small that effect may be. If somebody says, why did you do that? Almost always you'll reference some intended effect on the world. Even further, pleasure is awesome. Pain is terrible. Very few of us seek out pain or avoid pleasure on purpose. In fact, we call people who do such things pathological. We think there's something wrong with them. Even if we do subject ourselves to pain, it's almost always to avoid some greater pain or to achieve some greater pleasure. So it's still in terms of pleasure and pain. And even if we do avoid pleasure, it's almost always to achieve some greater pleasure later on or to avoid some greater pain later on. Utilitarianism makes perfect sense of this. Remember, we sum the net pleasure and pain of the consequences of any action. If I have to go to the dentist now to avoid all of my teeth falling out a few years down the road, then I subject myself to a little pain right now in order to avoid a lot of pain in the future, and so going to the dentist has a net increase in utility. And even further, the great curse of ethical theorizing throughout the ages has been making ethics mysterious or supernatural or otherworldly. People are very suspicious, as you might know, about making ethical claims. What's more obvious, what's more natural, what's more worldly than pleasure and pain? A theory based around pleasure and pain is entirely in line with naturalistic thinking, with our best science, and even further, it's entirely in line with an empirical view of how we come to learn about the world. Mill, remember, was an empiricist, and so he wanted to make sure that whatever ethical theory he came up with was in line with empiricism. Now, utilitarianism isn't just theoretically plausible. It also has a number of excellent benefits, things that we might be looking for if we were going to construct our own moral theory. Utilitarianism requires that we treat all people exactly the same, regardless of gender, sex, race, ethnicity, religion, etc. Thus, utilitarianism demolishes, pulls the rug out from under the claims of sexists, racists, and bigots of all stripes. My pleasure is exactly the same as the pleasure of someone who's of a different gender, or sex, or race, or ethnicity, or religion than I am. My pain is exactly the same as theirs. We're all the same, says Mill, says utilitarianism, according to the properties that are morally important. And it's not just about people. Utilitarianism requires that we treat all sentient creatures the same, regardless of whether those creatures are human persons or animals. If you step on my foot and it hurts me, that pain is exactly as morally relevant as is the pain of stepping on a dog's foot and hurting the dog. Now, dogs might not be able to experience higher pleasures and pains, but bodily pleasures and pains in me are exactly the same as those in a dog. My bodily pleasure is not any better than the bodily pleasure of a dog. A dog's bodily pain is not any less bad than my bodily pain. Thus, utilitarianism demolishes speciesist claims, claims that say that we are just better humans because we're of a different species than other animals, and it also provides a foundation for a robust animal ethics. It's no surprise that one of the most famous utilitarians, Peter Singer, is also one of the most famous defenders of the claim that we need to treat animals much better than we're currently treating them. And further, since the evidence for utilitarianism is manifest subjective feelings, we can easily tell whether an action is right or wrong by just checking to see whether it's increasing utility or whether it's increasing disutility. So there are a number of benefits to utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is very plausible. Unfortunately, almost no philosophers are utilitarians anymore, and it seems as though many of the philosophers who still are utilitarians are just defending a utilitarian position because it's the one they've been defending their entire career, or because they've gotten themselves so used to being utilitarians that they wouldn't want to give it up. Here are a few of the central problems with utilitarianism, and I should note that there are many more problems. Now, people have tried to respond to these problems. Most philosophers don't think that any of these responses are even close to plausible. First problem. According to utilitarian, there are no such things as right or wrong action types. An action type is a sort or kind of action. And this is just distinguished from an action token. This is just technical terminology, which is an individual performance of that action. So, for example, your eating breakfast this morning is a token of the type eating breakfast. My recording a lecture right now is a token of the type recording a lecture. My driving my car is an individual token of the type driving a car. So a general description of an action, that's a type. You actually performing a particular action on a particular occasion, that's a token. Now, most of us think that there are some action types that are right no matter what, and that there are some action types that are wrong no matter what. So, for example, most of us think that rape is wrong no matter what. If somebody says, so-and-so was raped, we're not confused about whether that was a bad thing. We think rape is wrong. It's the wrong thing to do. Further, most of us think that child and animal abuse is wrong no matter what. Similarly, most of us think that being charitable, giving to charity, is right no matter what. Most of us think that respecting others is right no matter what. However, according to utilitarianism, no action type is ever right or wrong. It's only action tokens that are right or wrong according to the utilitarian, because it's only individual performances of actions that have consequences, and an action has to have consequences in order to have a moral status. If you ask a utilitarian whether rape is wrong, she'll respond with, which rape are you talking about? A rape is only wrong according to a utilitarian if it produces disutility. Thus, for the utilitarian, the end always justifies the means. Think up something that you think is wrong. Rape, unjustifiable killing, torture, abuse. You can't tell whether those things are actually wrong unless you look at the actual consequences. And now, it's not impossible that torture, rape, abuse occasionally produce good consequences. Probably not most of the time, but it's not impossible that they occasionally do produce good consequences. In the instances where they produce good consequences, the utilitarian will say, that's a good action. They won't say, that's a generally bad action, but this time it produced good consequences. There is no such thing as a generally bad action, according to utilitarians. There's only the individual action as it was performed on a particular occasion, and if it has good consequences, no matter what type of action it is, it's a good action. Most people think that that is a very implausible result for a moral theory. Here's a second problem. According to utilitarianism, it's fine to merely use people. Nothing wrong with that. Imagine that you walk into a hospital, you're going to visit a friend. A doctor grabs you, kills you, and distributes your organs to 5 people who would have died that day without your organs. Or, imagine that you're the sheriff of a small town whose townspeople have been rioting because they think, falsely, that the town drunk is possessed by a demon. So you stage a show trial and you hang the drunk in the town square to stop people from rioting. Now, in each of these cases, someone has been merely used. In the first case, it's you as an organ factory. It doesn't really matter that you're a person, it matters that you have organs. In the second scenario, someone's merely been used as a scapegoat. It doesn't matter that that's a person, it matters that hanging them after framing them is going to stop the townspeople from rioting. Now, utilitarianism not only permits this using, but it also requires it. According to utilitarianism, people are mere cogs in a machine that produces pleasure and pain. You're not an individual. You're not something worthy of respect. You're not something that has rights. You're the sort of thing that ought to be used its entire life to produce the most pleasure possible, to minimize pain, and when you're all used up, that's the end of you. Sound implausible? Here's one more. If you can cheat on your significant other, get a lot of pleasure out of it, not feel guilty, and not get caught, utilitarianism requires that you cheat, that you use your significant other by lying to her or him. Why would this be? Well, promises carry no moral weight according to utilitarianism. Fidelity carries no moral weight. All that matters is how you feel afterwards. If you can do it, get away with it, not feel guilty, get a lot of pleasure out of it, do not tell your significant other. That'll make them feel bad. You're required to do whatever brings about the most pleasure. Again, most people find this sort of using disrespectful, not worthy of things like you and me. A third problem. Utilitarianism commits the naturalistic fallacy. This is a theoretical problem with how utilitarianism is motivated and spelled out. The naturalistic fallacy is the name given to the logical misstep of attempting to derive a normative or an ought proposition from a descriptive or an is proposition. This is a logical misstep because the mere fact that something is a certain way tells us nothing about whether it should or ought to be that way. However, utilitarianism commits this naturalistic fallacy. Pleasure and pain are mere descriptive states of sentient creatures. They tell us what is the case about them. They are, in fact, ways that sentient creatures feel or could feel at particular times. However, from the fact that a creature is or could be in a particular state, we can't conclude that it's morally better or morally worse for that creature to be in that state. So we can't go from this feels good to this ought to be the case, or this feels bad to this oughtn't be the case, without some further argumentation. Now, we usually understand this in even simpler terms. Sometimes what feels good isn't right. Sometimes what feels bad is necessary or is required. But according to utilitarianism, the things that feel good are always right, the things that feel bad are always wrong, everything else being equal. So this isn't like the first two problems, something that the utilitarian can say, yep, I recognize that that is unintuitive, but it's just the theory. Here, the utilitarian either needs to give us some reason for thinking that you can move from what is the case to what ought to be the case, or the utilitarian needs to give up on utilitarianism. A final problem. There's just no evidence for utilitarianism. John Stuart Mill, in Utilitarianism, equivocates in an argument in favor of the truth of utilitarianism. He uses one word in two different ways and makes an argumentative mistake in that way. And pretty much every utilitarianism since Mill has made the same mistake or refused to provide any evidence at all for utilitarianism. Here's Mill in Chapter 4 of Utilitarianism. The only proof capable of being given that an object is visible is that people actually see it. The only proof that a sound is audible is that people hear it. In like manner, I apprehend, the sole evidence it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people actually desire it. No reason can be given why the general happiness is desirable, except that each person, so far as he believes it to be attainable, desires his own happiness. we have not only all the proof which the case admits of, but all which it is possible to require that happiness is a good. That each person's happiness is a good to that person, and the general happiness, therefore, a good to the aggregate of all persons. But liking something tells us nothing about whether we ought to like that thing. This is the same lesson that we just learned from the naturalistic fallacy. To give a theory of why what we like should be liked would then be to appeal to some non-utilitarian moral theory. So the thought here is that in order to give evidence for utilitarianism, we would have to start appealing to some theory that wasn't utilitarianism, and then we wouldn't be utilitarians anymore. I noted that Mill equivocates in this argument, and he equivocates on that term desirable. He's using it in two different ways. In one way, what he means is that pleasure is desired. It's desirable in that way. But then he concludes that pleasure ought to be desired. Now, desirable can be used in both of those ways, but we can't use it in one way in the premises of an argument and then in a totally different way in the conclusion of an argument. So what lessons can we learn here? Well, the fact that utilitarianism is false, produces terrible results, commits numerous fallacies, and has no evidence in its favor should prompt us to conclude two things, one negative and one positive. Ethics is hard. Simply finding something that you like and then saying that that's the morally good thing is not admitting to how hard ethics is. It's abdicating your intellectual responsibility. That's the negative part. The positive. We shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater here. Even though utilitarianism is false, that doesn't mean that consequences or that pleasure can't be incorporated into some other moral theory, so long as that moral theory isn't a version of utilitarianism, since utilitarianism is false. We need to be very careful. Even very smart people are still out there claiming that utilitarianism is obviously right, and then refusing to engage with anyone who isn't a utilitarian. The most recent popular version of this is a book that was written by Sam Harris. Harris, in the first chapter of his book, just presumes that utilitarianism is true, and then says, and I'm not even going to interact with you if you don't think that utilitarianism is true. Well, arguing for the truth of utilitarianism is the only interesting moral thing that can be done in the vicinity of utilitarianism. If we know that it's true, it's easy to get what the consequences of utilitarianism are. In this lecture, we've looked at John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism, a normative moral theory that bases the moral status of actions on the goodness or badness of the consequences of those actions in terms of pleasure or pain. Good consequences are ones that have an increase in pleasure or a decrease in pain. Bad consequences are ones that have a decrease in pleasure or an increase in pain. We saw that utilitarianism is a plausible and beneficial moral theory at first blush. However, there are a number of serious and fatal problems for utilitarianism, so fatal that even though most philosophers recognize that utilitarianism has some plausible parts, there are almost no utilitarian professional philosophers out there today. Thank you.